Hi everyone, hopefully you can hear me. Welcome. Hi, welcome to book club this Friday. I've got the priorities here. I've got a nice fire on. If you can see that, you might be struggling a little on Instagram to see how nice my roaring fire is in the background. Massive mug of tea. So get yourself a cup of tea, get settled in. Give me a wave if you're joining me on Instagram. Great. Lovely. So welcome everybody. Welcome Facebook, welcome Instagram. For those of you who've not met me before or don't know who I am, I'm Fiona English. I'm the Executive Director of the King's Head Theatre. Very grateful to be bringing you today's live stream from my lovely in-laws house, so hence the gorgeous backdrop. So yes, welcome to the countryside. Today we're looking at Hedda Gabler and Henrik Ibsen's play. And for this, I'm going to give you a bit of context. If you've not read the play or you've not seen it, don't worry, that's absolutely fine. I'm just going to talk and hopefully that's interesting. And then I would say the way we always look at plays from a theatrical point of view is we're always thinking about the play as something that will be staged rather than the play as just a text. So if you've been reading it, maybe you've not read plays before, that's something to just really bear in mind. It's kind of different to how we look at a book when we're thinking critically. We're far more trying to think about what would this be like on stage? What would this be like in front of an audience? And what's the interaction like between the cast, the way that it's creatively set up, and the audience. So just bear that in mind when we're thinking about the play today. I've got some notes next to me, so forgive me if I'm looking down, that's what I'm looking at. So Hedda Gabler was written by Henrik Ibsen. So he's one of the kind of great stalwarts of playwriting. It's actually thought that he is the kind of second most performed playwright after Shakespeare. So hence one of the reasons why we're kind of starting with Ibsen. He's such a, I guess, narrative in our modern language. And it's interesting, if you don't really know this play, to realise that there's a huge amount of links that a lot of our modern playwrights definitely use when in terms of kind of classical references. So quite a few people talk about the actual character of Hedda Gabler itself. So it's, just to give you a little bit of background about what it is, it's a play that centres around we think Oslo. There's a different name for the community that we're in, but kind of a Oslo written in the 1890s, potentially the play slightly earlier, just because some of the references around lighting in particular and the way the streets are. So we're looking at Oslo roughly in the 1890s and centres around a woman, Hedda Tesman. So a married woman, newly married, just come back from honeymoon, of quite a high social rank, who's married someone who ultimately is kind of below her old school rank, George Tesman, and looks at her life, which is seen as kind of, I guess, a modern day look on what it means to be trapped. And I think it's really interesting. This play focuses a huge amount on isolation, including isolation within community. So when you're actually in a group and yet you feel isolated. And that's, I guess, another reason why we chose this as a starting point. It's such an interesting play to be looking at a time like this, where we are all kind of re-reminding ourselves of what does our online and offline experience look like. So to give you, again, just a bit of a plot if you don't know the play, so don't worry if you haven't read it. So Hedda is visited throughout the play by different characters, and the main groupings that we have are, we have the men and we have the women. So the women are different representations of female, I guess, almost female stereotypes. So George Tesman's aunt features, who is in her 60s, and a great example of a well-behaved woman, I would describe her as. She's very motherly, very caring, and really interested in what society thinks about her. So we have Thea, so Mrs. Elvsted, who is again a great example of maybe how women are meant to behave. And she has an interesting character arc, which is what I'm just using to describe, just that's a bit of jargon I realise I've used, but we often describe that as the way that the character starts, the kind of journey that we follow them on, and then how the character ends up at the end. So her character arc, we would describe that as. So her character arc kind of covers her love interests and what it's like to be, I guess, a servant to someone is the best way I would describe it. A kind of a traditional old school female experience of being in your place, we could almost say. So that's Thea. We've then got, and forgive me, I have the worst Norwegian pronunciation in the world, so I'm going with the like anglicized versions of the name. So if you're a Norwegian expert, I'm sorry in advance. We have Bertha, the servant, who features slightly, but it's just worth remembering that there's these, I like that Ibsen includes her because there's this extra female representation that we rarely see, but that does feature still on stage. So that's, I guess, and then we have Hedda. This, there's a really nice quote from Ibsen where he talks about the reason that he chose for the play to be called Hedda Gabler, not Hedda Tesman, which is her married name, is because she identifies far more as her father's daughter than as her husband's wife. And ultimately, that's one of the biggest and most important things, is Hedda's definition of herself is kind of what she's grown up with, who she believes she is. She's a highly educated woman, incredibly intelligent, has a strong sense of self and a strong sense of her voice, and finds herself marrying ultimately because she believes that she's beginning to be, I guess she might be left on the shelf is her worry. Obviously, we're thinking about 19th century Scandinavia in this case, but it's worth remembering that actually this is something that culturally still may exist. I'm in my 30s and talk often to my friends about what's the experience of it like to be a woman in your 30s, and considering if you want to have children, if you don't, what does that look like? And we live in obviously such a modern society in comparison to many other countries around the world. So just thinking about that, like what is it that by being a woman she feels trapped in and forced into marriage? It's interesting then, of course, because she is married, she also has this other, I guess, almost fear, this fear of what it might be like to be a mother, and would that in turn be a sense of trapping in its own rights? There's an interesting portrayal of Hedda. There's this quandary, I guess, she has. George, her husband, has the chance every day to go out and work, to prove himself, to be allowed to prove that he's intellectually worthy. And yet Hedda is forced to stay within the home. She is subject to only the visitors that come to her. And one of the interesting turns that has just happened in her life when we meet the play is that when she's returned from honeymoon, her husband tells them that financially they're not in the position that maybe Hedda thought they were. And the kind of parties and the really extrovert life that she was used to is going to have to change. And that's interesting. That's the kind of context and where we're placed. So all of this is happening in this play is set up in that environment. And it's worth just bearing in mind that while I started by saying we think about plays always when we're reading them as what is it like for an audience, what's it like to watch in a theatre, and the interesting context in which Ibsen is writing. So plays in the 19th century were often quite focused around comedy. The tradition of like music hall was really big. So audiences at the time were far more used to a kind of vaudeville style of theatre. So you might go and you would see some dance and some music and some theatre all at the same time in one night. And in this context, Ibsen starts to write these kind of window box worlds. And that's a style that is known as realism. More often nowadays, we kind of associate it with another style that came about 20 years after Ibsen was writing, naturalism. And just to give you a little bit of context, if you've heard that word, maybe you don't know what it is. So there was a practitioner, by which I just mean somebody who practiced theatre. We call them a practitioner. Often they write big theory books about their ways of working and how you can follow it. So there was a practitioner called Stanislavski who wrote a lot about how theatre, in his belief, he worked predominantly at the Moscow Arts Theatre in Russia. Theatre should be a fourth wall window box into someone's world, and that's when true theatrical encounter and experience happened, and that's naturalism. So when I say fourth wall, I mean just as you now are ultimately creating the fourth wall of my viewing experience. I've got my left-hand wall, right-hand wall, back wall, and you're my front wall. It's as though you've been cut out. I wouldn't be able to speak to you if we were in that fourth wall experience, but instead, say, I'd be having a chat to somebody next to me and you'd be seeing a kind of window into my everyday existence, rather than this is kind of a direct address, we'd call this. So the audience isn't, we imagine the audience isn't there. Often the set is really, it's really highly realistic. So we wouldn't have, say, if there's a lot of painting that features in Hedda Gabler. It's quite an important piece that Ibsen writes at the very start. He writes what we call stage directions, so little notes for whoever's directing. And in his stage directions, he writes that there is centre stage in this beautiful dark living room. Dark being interesting as well. It's a Hedda's world. The colours are quite dark of the living room. But centre stage, there is a massive portrait of Hedda's father. And that sits throughout the whole play. So within the whole play, we always have this this large presence of Hedda's father right at the heart of the story, telling us that, again, this is the man in Hedda's life, this is how Hedda defines herself. And things like that, rather than us maybe having something that is stylized. So rather than having, say, I don't know, a 3D painting or a video, if we were doing it in a naturalistic way, then we would have a kind of authentically sized and painted picture. But it's just worth remembering that as much as naturalism has become associated with Ibsen's works, the Moscow Arts Theatre kind of performed three main playwrights. Chekhov is the most famous one, Gorky, and then Ibsen. Actually, Ibsen writes before naturalism and writes far more in a realism sense. So just remembering that while this is realistic, naturalism is actually something that comes slightly later, different practitioner, and it's worth us separating them. And actually that gives us real freedom as theatre makers to think, this is a realistic play. It's written as though we've kind of got a window into Hedda's world and Hedda's narrative, but it isn't naturalistic. So just for a little bit, I'm going to talk about some of the characters that feature, and just having a think about who they are and what they do. So unhelpfully, the notes that I have left for myself on the side have got a password on them, so I cannot look at them. So I'm just going to look at them in front of me. So first and foremost, if we talk a little bit about the men in Hedda's life. So I've told you a little bit about the female characters, and let's have a little bit of a think about the male characters. So there's Lovborg, who's kind of this wild love interest. He's kind of described as this this heroic figure, I guess, that Hedda falls in love with. Does she fall in love with him? Up for debate. I'm happy for you to comment whether you agree with that or not. Maybe she is more either lusting after him or lusting after his freedom. Maybe she's lusting after being like him, having the freedom of him. But ultimately, this kind of this desired character. Thank you, Graham, who's just unlocked the laptop next to me. So Lovborg, this academic with a wild, free life. He lives to his sole purpose, he finds, is to write this manuscript that he's been working on. He's got this great passion for it. And the reason I've chosen my fireside setting is for, if you've read Hedda Gabler, one of my favourite scenes in any play is Hedda burns Lovborg's manuscript when she ultimately feels like he's turning his attention away from her. And I personally I think Ibsen writes in a more clever way than it just being she's in love with him and she's angry that he's in love with someone else. I think there's something far more nuanced in it, in her sense of feeling that she doesn't have the same kind of freedom that he has, and she doesn't understand. I've just got a question there from Alan. Great question. Yeah, is Lovborg a hero? Really good question. What do you think? Please comment. I think one of the problems that actually comes up in Hedda is any life that we're presented with is far from perfect. So Brandt, the judge that we come across, he's got the kind of the right role. He's well paid, and yet he obviously is this horrible, manipulative man. There's a written myself the one quote. So Brack has this quote that is just awful, where at the end, so Hedda, I'm sorry, this is a massive case of spoilers, but Lovborg kills himself towards the end of the play. And one of Hedda's kind of, I guess, breaking moments is when she, thinking that he has led this poetic death, this glorious suicide, she almost views it as his one real sense of claiming freedom. She actually realizes that he's been killed in a fight in a brothel. So kind of all her views of everything that Lovborg represents, which I definitely think, rather than being a hero to her, is more a sense of heroic freedom. He actually kind of crashes down to her world. Even her view of like, can you even have a perfect death, is ruined. And when we find out that Lovborg has died, this news is brought on. We're brought into this final act of the play, and the audience can kind of feel that something is coming. We can feel the suspense of something coming. And Brack, the judge, comes in and says to Hedda, tells her, the police have found a pistol, and questions whether it's Hedda's father's pistols that Brack knows she has in the house. She's very proud of them. They're this huge symbol of, again, freedom, but the life that she had beforehand, a classic symbol potentially of masculinity, but something that Hedda, that's one of the things where Hedda finds life hard, where people take things that are seen as masculine symbols, power, guns, freedom, and don't allow her to have them. So they question where, like, he questions the judge, where did he get the gun from, Hedda? And when Hedda realizes that it's known, she questions, like, what will happen to me? What will happen if they find out who gave him the pistol? And Brack says, don't worry, I'll make sure that doesn't happen. And then says the line, and then Hedda says the line to him, so I'm in your power, Judge Brack. You have at your beck and call. You have me at your beck and call from this time forward. And so we see that this external view of someone who is maybe successful, who has power, he is ultimately this, I was going to say slime ball, that is not the most accurate description or word, but he kind of makes our skin crawl towards the end as we realise the way he's willing to use his power over Hedda. So I've talked a little bit, I've been talking about the men, for those of you who've just joined me, in Hedda Gabler. So we have George Tesmond's Hedda's husband. So I mentioned slightly earlier that Hedda's got married ultimately because she feels like she has come to a time in her life where she doesn't have many other options. Life is running out. She was very much seen in her youth as this kind of belle of the ball. Everyone wanted her, but partially because she's been brought up as an only child with a very successful father, highly educated. She's also found herself being slightly unattainable and maybe not finding the right match for herself. So she reaches a point where she feels like she has to get married, and chooses to marry George Tesmond, feeling that he is quite not a lesser of two evils, but I guess a calming, safe choice of husband, which I don't think is the reason maybe that anyone who has got married would say is the right reason to marry someone, a kind of a tame, safe choice, rather than there being any passion in their relationship. And it's quite obvious early on that she's not in love with him. And that creates a new sense of entrapment. Obviously, she has no rights as a single woman in that society, I'm sure you can imagine. But in turn, being his husband, this man she doesn't love and doesn't have affection for, creates a new form of entrapment for her. And we have this, I think, as audience members, this wonderfully horrible tension in how we feel about George, because he is ultimately a bit of a bumbling idiot, but his intentions are so well placed that it's really hard to not feel for him, because he does love Hedda, although I think the problem is that he loves a slightly different version of her to her real true self. He loves a version that in his head he's created of this kind of perfect wife, this calm potential mother. And she ultimately is this like wild, free bird, rather than this kind of perfectly ready to be tamed or caged animal. And so while while we care about him and we think great things about him, as the audience, we're kind of placed in this awkward position of seeing that he's very genuine, but also feeling horribly like Hedda deserves more. And there's real power in that. Again, with the time we're talking about, so 19th century, there's real power in a playwright showing us a woman who deserves more freedom and deserves more from life. I think that's it's a really kind of an interesting choice to play such a female character and give her such power in her powerlessness. So some other thoughts, just thinking about that kind of what kind of woman is Hedda. So I would again, like, really focusing, we're trying to focus again on what we, the audience, see her as, rather than necessarily how she reads. And it's always worth remembering that when we're reading plays, we're looking not just for what is written line by line, but we're also looking for subtext. So as much as Ibsen writes certain lines, there's the kind of the stuff in between the lines that we call subtext. So I might say to you in if I meet you for a coffee, oh, I love those earrings that you have on. But the subtext might be like, oh, I totally know that you were talking about me behind my back last week. And so we're always looking for that differentiation. And I think that this whole piece is so right with subtext. Everything that Hedda says has a different meaning. And you can imagine, I'm sure, a lot of the certain inflections that she uses, the certain ways that maybe she's sarcastic or not. And while that's not written in the stage directions, that's one of the real powers that a director has. Is a director is looking at a play like this and making choices like what are her intentions is a big one that we'll ask at the start of a scene. So an exercise that's often done by directors when they do get a play with their actors, and the first setting is they'll look at the intentions for each scene. So say we're looking at Hedda in the very last act. So we found out that Lovborg's died. Hedda's questioning, what do I want out of this? That's the question we might ask ourselves. What does Hedda want when she comes into that setting? When the judge reveals to her that he knows that Lovborg has been killed because Hedda gave Lovborg the pistol, what do we think how does Hedda feel? And what is it that she wants out of it? And so, again, I'm afraid, massive spoiler if you've not read it, but the very end of the piece, Hedda walks into, there's an inner room that's been on stage the whole time, which is curtained. Hedda walks into this inner room, pulls the curtains shut, plays a really short, frenzied dance piece of music on the piano. Her husband shouts at her, like, Hedda, this isn't the time. And she goes, don't worry, I'll be quiet, and kills herself in the inner room. And then the whole cast run to the room, open the doors, and Judge Brack says, people don't do this. Like, this isn't something people do. Like, incredible ending of a piece. So in this very end moment, if you're playing the character of Hedda, what are your intentions when you go into that room? Because all your lines beforehand then have different meaning as you give them. When you say the line of, don't worry, I'll be silent from now on, don't worry, I'll be quiet from now on, you're not meaning it in that specific moment. You're actually meaning in a far greater sense. And so there's power then that we're able to give to the language and to the way that the playwright has written it that goes beyond that. We kind of we write our meaning into it when we then perform it. And that's something that a big part of being a director is about, translating what we think the playwright said, what the intentions are, how the actors should deliver it. And that's, I guess, a challenge for directors. But a really one for this play that I think you can probably really see how the lines, the way we read them in our heads, we already start to hear how we'd hear them spoken. And there's something really beautiful in that it really gives us a sense of our imagination is able to be really free when we read play text like this, because we can start to really paint a really visual picture of what it would look like on stage. Another thing that I just thought would be interesting to have a think about was this feeling of entrapment that Hedda faces. So there's quite a few different ways that she feels trapped. And I wonder if you are watching along, do you want to maybe comment with some views, different forms of ways that she feels trapped, or symbols even that are given? So quite often playwrights will use different symbols as ways to help point us to things. And that could be in the set design, so the way it looks, it could be in certain words that are spoken, or it could be in repeated use of language. So for example, in the Cherry Orchard, there is this beautiful these beautiful trees outside that exist, and towards the end of the play the trees get cut down, and that symbol ultimately speaks of what is happening in the main narratives of the piece. So sometimes playwrights can speak to us also through symbols that exist, and sometimes directors will create those as well, or set designers will create those. But have a think if you can think about specifically entrapment. So some of the things that I thought about in terms of that were Hedda's age is a big one. So she's felt at a certain time of life that she has no options because of her age. So being married isn't something that necessarily she's chosen, but being single isn't really possible in her society either. The freedom of being someone's wife is actually a far more secure place than being a single woman after her father dies, and she's kind of left with this option of how long she can survive by herself versus when she would be able to get married or not because of age. And then, of course, one of the things that does then create a new form of entrapment is her marriage. So her marriage in itself then becomes a new form of being trapped for her. She's ultimately at her husband's whim. If her husband decides for the household, we're not having parties anymore. I've decided that I don't want to go for this well-paid professor job. I'm actually really happy doing what I am. So we're going to need to cut back financially. There's no equality in that we're presented with by Ibsen in this case. She's forced to, I guess, be at George's, at whatever George decides she is subject to. There's this interesting as well, like potential entrapment that is coming of being a mother. So while kind of marriage is one form of entrapment, then Hedda, who like fiercely independent and almost selfish, but I don't mean in an unkind way. She's got a strong sense of who she is and her identity. And if she were to become a mother, the form of additional entrapment that would create is kind of looming over her. Interestingly, love is another form of trap that comes up repeatedly. So we see both the way that she feels about Loveborg and also the way that the judge feels towards her. All of these things also trap her in her situation, which I think is really hard. And then, of course, at the end, the ultimate, I guess, nail in the coffin, the deciding factor, when Brack blackmails her at the end, there literally feels like there is no way out. She feels like she will be almost a servant for the rest of her life, trapped inside her own house, trapped at these men's whims. Great question here from Kane. Would you say Hedda and Nora from A Doll's House are the same? Truthfully, I think a lot of Ibsen's characters are written off a similar vein. I think a lot of his women have this like before their time belief that they are stuck, that they are trapped, that they deserve something more. Actually, is the really interesting thing. I think Ibsen has this power in saying, don't these women deserve some more equality? Which I think is amazing. If you think about the time that this is being watched, the people who would be going to see this, the venues that we're talking about it being seen on at, and this representation of don't these women deserve more freedom? Look at these incredible, intelligent women, and don't they think like the men? Why are we treating them differently? And I think that that's definitely true in quite a few of Ibsen's plays at the time. A Doll's House is a really great example. My final thought, and something to leave you with as we think about this as playwrights, just give yourself 2 minutes, and I want you to imagine that you're going to be the set designer on this. So you're designing what it looks like, how it feels, and I'm going to set you a couple of, so just this is a bit of a thinking exercise, a couple of pointers that we get from Ibsen that matter. So we're told that we're in a dark drawing room, but that we can see the outside, so we can see the external world. Think about if that's important for you or not. We have reference of the piano. The piano's used as well. Obviously, I mentioned that just as Hedda goes to commit suicide at the end, that fierce dance that's played, and we see at other times where she's fidgety, her touching keys and going around. The portrait that I spoke about hanging center stage, this figure of the general, her father, hanging over her, literally hanging over her as a metaphor, both as it's actually hanging up on the wall. The burning of the manuscript requires some kind of fire, potentially, some kind of way that you would do that. How would you portray that? would you leave bits of the manuscript left? Would you like leave the ashes? Would you allow people to clean it up? Would Bertha be cleaning the next time? Like there's something really beautiful I think you can do in that when Lovborg comes desperately looking for where his manuscript is, and the knowledge that Hedda has of the fact it's gone. And then the shooting at the end, the use of that in a room, how much do you want to show your audience? Is there power in not showing your audience anything because they know? The 2012 version of this that was on at the Old Vic with Sheridan Smith in it was beautiful. They drew the curtains across and you saw the shadow of Hedda fall as she shot herself, which was just like arresting and horrible. Is there power in showing it? Is there not? These are kind of the kind of choices that you have to make as a director putting this on. Like how much do you want to show your audience? How much do you want to imply to them? How intelligent do you take your audience as? Are you allowing them to draw those, to miss things, to draw their own conclusions? Like what freedom do you want to give them as viewers of this? Kevin said Ibsen was way ahead of his time. I directed A Doll's House and there's so much in that play. It's true. And I think it's really relevant now. I saw, for those of you who are watching other bits of the news that are not just about our current medical crisis, I saw that the Nabraya rapists from Delhi were hung today in India. And it's interesting to think, while we're looking at Hedda, of that same place of power and women and how women are represented. And today in society, is that still a problem that we have in the way various societies view women, or even, and I guess this is one of the real challenges in Hedda, in even if there is a right way to be a woman, is there a kind of perfect representation of how we should be? Do we care about what society thinks? I think that's a challenge for us at the minute, especially. Do we care about our representation on social media, about how others view us, about what people think about us, whether that's physical health, mental health, how we look, how people portray us, if we're single, if we're not, if we're straight, if we're gay, just that representation factor and what society views as good or not is really interesting, and I think is something that still makes Hedda so relevant to today. I definitely think that if you imagine we've talked about societal context, I think if you were directing this today, that'd be a really interesting thing to consider. Is there a society that you would choose to potentially place this in that wasn't 1890s Norway, that would still have that slight sense of uncomfortableness, of something is not right, of it's not balanced, the world is not perfect? And to be honest, I think you could still do that in the UK today. I think there's many examples of why equality is we're still far from there, but it'd be an interesting thing for you to consider as directors. I'm going to leave you there. I really hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next week, we're going to look at one of the real powerhouses of 20th century and 21st century playwriting. We're going to look at Carol Churchill play. I'll put the link for you to read it online. We're going to be using Drama Online, which is a great resource. So hopefully you can read it without needing to go out and about. But thank you. I hope that you're able to find freedom in your current potentially trapped situations. Loads of love. Thanks for joining us.